couple of topics that we want to make sure we go over in terms of the implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and then on the work that we've been doing to lay the groundwork to create trade agreements between indigenous nations and engage in trade relations.
Before, I'm from Nicaragua, from indigenous nation, the Miskito. We live because there is a border that was created between Nicaragua and Honduras. We live in Honduras and Nicaragua. So our nation, the Miskito Nation, since 22 years ago, exercises what we call an autonomy law. In Nicaragua, in 1987, the Nicaraguan government approved an autonomy law that recognizes indigenous people's rights, and so practically 50% of the Nicaraguan territory is under the autonomous government. And so now we have almost 22 years of autonomy, of self-government, and I really enjoy the meeting these 2 days because I feel that I have learned a lot of things that you're doing that we can apply in Nicaragua. So I feel that it was a very important opportunity to see how the tribal leaders can come together and define policies, and how you can also advocate for those policies. Because in our autonomy law, we have a regional autonomy, but in the region, we have each one of the communities have also autonomy. So it is something similar. I'm actually the member of the permanent forum that was supported by indigenous organizations in the last election. The permanent forum is a subsidiary body of the Commission of Economic and Social Affairs of the UN. I would say that after 30 years of struggling in the UN system, we were able to create this body that makes recommendations to ECOSOC. ECOSOC is this body of Economic and Social Affairs, and once our recommendations are approved by ECOSOC, they become policies for the UN system and for governance. This year we are celebrating the 10th anniversary of the UN Permanent Forum. The mandate of the UN Permanent Forum is to make recommendations, to work with the UN agencies to include indigenous people's rights in all of their work. And since 2007, we have another mandate that is to oversee the implementation of the UN Declaration of Indigenous Peoples' Rights. So we have how we organize our work. We are 16 independent experts. That is the term that they use at the UN. And it means that we don't depend from government and from nobody. We are independent, so this gives us enough, I would say, authority to say things that we consider are very important for indigenous peoples. We come from 7 regions, from the Arctic, Pacific, Africa, Asia, North America, Europe, and Latin America. And 2 members come from each region, one that is appointed or recommended by governments, and one from indigenous organizations. So I came from indigenous organizations from Latin America. The 6 areas of the mandate of the Permanent Forum are health, education, social development, human rights, environment, and culture. Those are the 6 areas. And we organize our work in 19 different areas that it covers these 6 areas of work. To do our work, we make visits, we come to meetings of like this type, and we meet once a year. We have a pre-sessional meeting where we agree as 16 members how we are going to organize our session. The session is 2 weeks in May, and we have it in New York, but we can have the session so any other place, but until now it has been only in New York. During the session, anybody can attend the session. It's open. You just have to get into, you can, right now, it's already open, so you can register yourself. This afternoon, I heard one of the problems is that at the UN, usually only NGOs are considered civil society. But at the permanent forum is more, I would say, any indigenous person can participate in the permanent forum. You don't have to have a special status as NGO. So we usually have 2,000 participants, between 1,500 to 2,000 participants in the sessions between governments, international agencies, and indigenous organizations. And everybody has the opportunity to speak. Of course, during 2 weeks, it is very difficult for everybody to speak. So what indigenous organizations usually do is organize as caucus. So we have regional caucuses and a global caucus that meets the day before the session and go over the points that will be discussed. Our next session is in May next year, and the themes that we will address are the implementation of the declaration. This is a theme that we have every year, and what we expect is to listen to good practices, and of course listen to problems, but also receive recommendations. Another theme that we will be discussing will be the right to food and food sovereignty. This is an important theme because it also linked with other themes that are being discussed during 2012. The Rio +20 World Conference will happen in 2012. And also it links with a special session on women's rights that will be on rural women this year, the CSW. So we consider this an important theme for indigenous peoples. The special theme of this year next year is the doctrine of discovery. The doctrine of discovery and the way in which that doctrine impacts in indigenous people's life. So that is another theme. And we will also have a half-day discussion on the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples. This is on the future work. In January, we are having a special session on violence against indigenous women and girls, and the report of that expert meeting will also be presented in the permanent forum. What are the areas that we are working on? As I mentioned, there is this World Conference on Sustainable Development. This will happen in June in Rio de Janeiro, and it's 20 years after the first World Earth Summit. And I heard someone mention the Earth Summit today, someone that was there 20 years ago in Rio de Janeiro. And there, indigenous peoples didn't have the opportunity to participate fully in the definition of what came out. But they organized 20 years ago a special conference and a declaration that is called Carioca II. Carioca came out from there. So now we are trying to have another Carioca II for 2012. So we had a preparatory meeting in August in Brazil, in Manaus, and we organized a steering committee. And for North America, there is a steering committee, and some members of the tribal organizations are members of the steering committee. And what we have done is work on a document that was submitted yesterday because it was the deadline for the zero draft document of the Secretary General on Rio Plus 20. The two themes that the governments are trying to promote for this meeting is something that is called green economy. And of course, green economy for indigenous peoples doesn't mean the same thing as for corporations and governments. So we are also working on what we consider should be the main themes for Rio Plus 20 and the institutional arrangement for sustainable development. These are the two areas. For indigenous peoples, we have identified 4 areas of priority. One is our concept of development. We consider that we should not be discussing sustainable development if we do not promote our own concept of development. The second is the impact of corporations on indigenous peoples' land, territories, and natural resources. The third is food sovereignty. And the fourth is indigenous people's participation. So these are the areas that we are trying to promote, and we're trying to change the way in which we will participate in Rio Plus 20. The other area that we are discussing is the World Conference. The General Assembly of United Nations adopted last year a resolution that in 2014, there will be a World Conference on indigenous peoples, on, not off. So that is the big discussion. So now we are at the permanent forum with the other 2 mechanisms in the UN on indigenous peoples, that is the expert mechanism and the special rapporteur. We have to work together with the President of the General Assembly to define the modality of this World Conference. Because in these 20 years, things have changed a lot with the adoption of the declaration, because the declaration calls for full and effective participation of indigenous peoples. So the governments cannot have a World Conference without our full and effective participation. So we are discussing with the General Assembly now how this participation will be. So we are now in the process of defining the modality of looking at government that would play the role of facilitator, but also we are in the process of defining what should be the outcomes of this World Conference. What we expect in 2014 should be the outcome of such conference. And of course, we see 2014 as an opportunity because it will be the end of the 2nd decade on indigenous peoples of the UN. And for the governments, it's the end of the MDGs. So it is an opportunity to input on something completely different. Now, the UN Declaration is an important instrument in the recognition of the rights of indigenous peoples, and we see this as the opportunity to engage governments in the discussion of the declaration, engage parliaments. Next year will be the 5th anniversary of the adoption of the declaration. We have been, after your meeting in India, we have been working on a handbook for parliamentarians, and we expect with the Interparliamentarian Union to launch that handbook in April. And what we expect is that different parliaments in different parts of the world endorse the declaration during 2012. But we also expect that tribal governments, local autonomous governments endorse the declaration. We think that the 5th anniversary should be an opportunity for people to get to know the declaration more, because one of the challenges is that a lot of indigenous people still do not know the declaration. So we need to use this 5th anniversary as an opportunity for people to get to know more what is the declaration and to use it more. I think so I would just like to say that I see your movement, the League, as an opportunity to exchange good practices on how tribal organizations, how indigenous governments are really using the declaration to advance in the rights of indigenous peoples. There are a lot of different experiences in different parts of the world, from countries like, let's say, the African countries in which indigenous peoples are facing so much problems because the majority of government do not recognize them. But last year we had, for the first time, one of the Central African country that adopted the Convention 169 of the ILO. The Kenya government changed their constitution and included the recognition of indigenous peoples and minorities. So there are some changes. In Asia, we also see changes. In the Philippines, there is a good legislation on the rights of indigenous peoples. Latin America, at least 17 countries recognize indigenous peoples in their constitution, and they are using the declaration to advance in the rights on free, prior, and informed consent, on the right of indigenous peoples over land rights, natural resources, over education. So there are changes that are happening, and I think that the work that you are promoting here is something important, because as we say in the Miskito culture, if something happens to you, it is happening to me. So we are facing so many challenges with climate change, with financial crisis, with food crisis, that we cannot do things alone and in isolation, because things will not change if we're not united. So I think any effort to bring indigenous peoples together will make things change. We are in the process of negotiations on climate change, for example, and we have advanced so little as indigenous peoples, so little. Of course, the world has advanced a lot, but we have advanced very, very little. In the 8 themes that they're discussing, only in one of them they have included the recognition of the declaration. So we still have to work together as indigenous peoples and use these other mechanisms that we created at the UN. The UN Permanent Forum is the product of the work of indigenous peoples from all over the world. The UN Declaration of Indigenous Peoples is something that in which thousands of indigenous peoples have been involved in the last 30 years. So we have to use those instruments that we have created. We have to teach about them, we have to talk about them, and we have to use them. We can use them every day in our classes, as teachers, in our work as leaders, in our work as health workers, whatever, in any area, because the UN Declaration is the instrument that specifies how indigenous peoples can exercise all of the human rights that are recognized in other instruments. So it gives us the opportunity to say how education should be for indigenous people, how health should be for indigenous peoples. And in that way, we will begin to teach people to look at the instruments of human rights, not only from the point of view or the individual perspective, but combining the individual and the collective perspective of human rights. That is, I would say, what we have as indigenous peoples offered to humanity. We have opened that possibility to include in one instrument collective rights for human rights holders that are not government. Let's say in the concept of government that they have. So I want to thank you again for inviting me and invite you to participate in the permanent forum. Maybe you should take the treaty as an example of how you're implementing the declaration and how you expect to exchange among indigenous peoples to exercise our rights. Thank you.